Welcome back to Family Twist. It's been a minute since there was just a Corey and Kendall episode, so we thought, here it is, October 1st, 2024, the beginning of spooky season, our favorite time of year. So let's dig into that.
Okay, sounds good.
So something that I don't think you and I have really talked about too much was the Halloween season when you were little Kendall being raised by your adoptive parents, Betty and Rubel.
My parents, it's so funny. I think of them as super conservative in some ways, and in other ways they weren't. And this is one way that I think they were always sort of pushing the envelope because they were so heavily involved in our Southern Baptist church. For listeners who aren't familiar with Southern Baptist churches, they often are very anti-Halloween, anything that even alludes to demonic activity, that sort of thing. So
Satan's going to pull you to hell.
Exactly. So mom and dad, though, loved Halloween. And I remember picking up on that really early. And I would even ask them, are we supposed to be doing this? My parents had a lot of those. Now they'd be antique, but paper, cardboard-based art that...
Like the ones with the arms and legs that would move, they were like hinged sort
Yes.
of? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
So mom and dad loved those. My dad would just tack those up and he'd make them do silly things, like they weren't in scary poses per se. They were just being silly. I remember they had a witch, a skeleton, a werewolf, and something else. And one year I remember my dad making those cutout creatures do the YMCA across the front of the house. It was just cute. That's another thing that dates me. So if you don't know what the YMCA dance is, kids, go look that up. But anyway, so
I think it's pretty universal. I think it carries through all the generations.
Yeah, I think so. I think I've seen it at weddings and things. They were coming at it from a comedic standpoint. And so when we would be at church and I would hear, we're not supposed to celebrate this, it was always odd to me because for me, it was like no big deal. And why are we acting like this is, scary? I'm using air quotes. So, I think about my parents did push things a bit. I remember going to a Halloween party at church and my mother had dressed as a witch and that was really not okay. She wouldn't publicly say anything to anybody and people were probably pretty nice to her about her faux pas. But once we got home, I remember her saying to my dad, like, oh my gosh, they're so uptight and, everything's a big deal. I always think about the dichotomy between these uber religious people that I was raised around at the church, and then my parents who were always kind of straddling the line between fun and scary. That always sticks with me.
Who took you trick-or-treating?
They did. So you'd have to know my own town. There were areas in town that were walkable. Where we lived was not. So we lived right outside the city limits, about a quarter of a mile, which is far enough on a gravel road that nobody's walking past your house. So when we had trick-or-treaters, they had to be driven to our house, right? So A, it wasn't common for us to have many. And B, my hometown was so small that you knew everybody anyway. It's so different than nowadays. Corey, you and I have laughed about how it seems like parents will just bring hordes of children to this neighborhood where we live now. They don't live here. They're like coming in van loads to let people out to come and trick or treat. That is not the way it was when I was growing up. When I was taken trick or treating, my parents' friends' houses were not necessarily close to each other. And you'd have to know my mom, there is no way in hell that she was going to let me walk up to a stranger's house, period, ever. That was never going to happen. So it was a very strategic. I remember getting the map out of our little town and I would strategically make a plan for how the evening was going to progress. So we have to go to Mr. and Mrs. Lane's house first. And then I made it so that there was a logical route that my parents could use when taking me trick-or-treating. So very different, I know, than the way that you described how you grew up.
For sure. Yes. When we were super young, mom would take us trick-or-treating. And then probably by the time we were 9 or 10, a group of friends would just go on our own. And depending on whose neighborhood we were in, we would just go and go and go. Usually like from dusk, hitting it like right before 5 p.m. until like 8 o'clock was sort of the cutoff, at least for like the grade school kids. I do remember, coming home, and then after we were home and, trading our candy and everything, then that's when the high school kids who weren't wearing costumes were starting to, knock on the door. And Dad always gave them a hard time. And I mean, if you didn't tell a joke, you weren't getting candy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall what some of your costumes were when you were a little kid?
Yep. Again, when I was super little and we were always heavily involved in church. But when I was super little, my parents were really trying to toe the line. So I was always doing, cutesy outfits. Like I was this scarecrow one year. I was, the Cowardly Lion from The Wizard of Oz. My mother was very creative, so she could make something silly like that and make people laugh. That's exactly what she was going to do. So it wasn't until I was an older child, and to your point, going out with friends without the parental oversight as much as we should have had it, then I was doing scary things like Dracula and, all that sort of thing. Zombies.
Well, I mean, Halloween's always been big for us as a couple, too. I mean, we really went all out, for several years when we first started dating. That very first Halloween in 2005, I mean, we spent a long time creating our Rocky Horror Picture Show themed outfits. Kendall was Frankenfurter and I was Eddie. And a lot of fun. I mean, I got like a super, super cheap leather jacket from eBay for like $15 and just completely destroyed it. Took the sleeves off and, sewed the stuff on the back. And then we borrowed a corset for Kendall. And we full bang. Like we were trying to go for screen accuracy for sure.
Yeah. And then we did go see the show that night.
Yes.
The night that we dressed like that. Which I don't know if that was on Halloween.
It was
I think it was too.
Yes, because we went to a Halloween party first.
Yep.
And then, of course, the traditional Rocky Horror Picture Show screening is midnight.
And there was even a contest, like a costume contest for those who had dressed as one of the Rocky Horror Picture Show characters.
And Kendall was robbed. And I will tell you, his Frankenfurter costume was dead on perfect. So this is kind of a little bit of a hodgepodge episode of Family Twist, but I wanted to make sure that we mentioned one of our past guests and friends, Lauren Lowe. I'm going to massacre your last name. Let's just call her Lauren Lowe. She is a hysterical comedian, and she told this story on the podcast.
My mom was pregnant. And she's too boring to cuckold my dad, unfortunately. But nothing exciting. And so we're like, what could it be? And they had 3 other kids who look exactly like them. And short, little, dark Italians, very different genes. Academically, so different. And intellectually and just socially. So, and I'd always ask, and they would just be like, it's all in your head, basically. And then my grandfather got worried that my grandfather was worried that I wouldn't feel like part of the family. So this is a guy who never graduated high school, off the boat from Sicily. He went to the library like an MIT research scientist and came back with one historical fact to explain me. And he was like, Lauren, okay. Because he didn't know about the sperm donation, by the way. No one knew. It's a huge secret. So he didn't know. So he was just trying to make me feel better. And he was like, okay, Lauren, this is how you came to be. The Vikings invaded Sicily. So I'm walking around like a fucking moron telling everyone I'm a fucking Viking. I was in Bergen and I'm sitting there like, oh, my fucking roots, like a fucking idiot.
She wrote a short film called Honestly, a film from Misfits, and it is post-production time. And there is a Seed and Spark campaign going on right now. And there's just a few days left to make a donation. And it would be so awesome if you could just give a couple of bucks and let's get Lauren's film out there. She's really starting to embrace her donor conception story in her writing and now filmmaking and comedy. And we applaud her for that. So let's support her as well. We will have the links in the show notes, and we'll be posting about this on our social media as well. All right. Now that we've done our Family Twist community service, I think we should do a little self-service as well and remind folks that we recently launched our second podcast called Horror Heals. We're continuing to kind of run into some gray area between Family Twist and Horror Heals. This past month, I went to 2 different horror conventions in Massachusetts, and thank goodness we finally have really cool annual horror conventions in Massachusetts, because I'd been traveling to New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Maryland. Not that I don't enjoy doing that, but it's easy for us to, just have me go to Massachusetts for like one night, while Kendall is here taking care of the babies.
Exactly. And something else that I think we should note, even though we don't say her name, yesterday was my birth mother's 70th birthday. And shout out to her. I don't think she'll listen to this, and she definitely won't care that I'm giving her a birthday wish, but I feel that I would be remiss in not sort of recognizing that as an occasion. And now both of my birth parents are 70 years old.
But I'm just so pleased that there's such a similar great vibe with these different communities. Since we've been doing this podcast for the last 2.5 years, Kendall and I have become part of the DNA surprise community, D's, donor conceived people, the whole gamut, and such a warm, loving community of people. And I've been part of the horror convention community for quite a few years now, but I just feel that relationship deepening too. And, just as I was getting ready to go to the convention on Friday night, we got this lovely direct message to our Instagram, the Horror Heals Instagram, from someone who said that they were so thankful they stumbled upon the podcast, that they were emotionally and physically abused by their mother growing up, and binging horror movies was like a way to escape that reality. And that's something I think we've been finding like more and more of. People were a little surprised when we talked about the topic of horror movies and horror culture being positive for our mental wellness. But it's true. And we're seeing this time and time again. I probably had 30 to 40 conversations on Friday night just kind of talking about that as a concept. And people immediately get it. Like, all I have to say is, oh yeah, our podcast is about how horror is good for mental wellness. And like, they smile and their eyes light up and they immediately are like, yes, absolutely. It totally is.
Yep. And I really haven't alluded to it very often on the Family Twist podcast, but another crossover is exactly that. Corey knows a lot about my adoptive father's alcoholism and how that affected my family life as a young teenager. And we'll talk about that probably on both podcasts at some point in the future. And that is just to bring it to light. I've forgiven my father for a lot of that trauma that he caused our family during that period. And I know why it happened. He couldn't deal with my adoptive mother's death very well, or well at all. And that really triggered a lot of his alcoholism. So we'll talk about that in the future, but that's important to mention, I think, at this point.
And I think, we're seeing a lot of those themes in both podcasts and people's stories. Like, there's a lot of history of alcohol and drug abuse in families, and emotional and physical abuse, across the board. And it's, it's sometimes painful for people to talk about, to think about. So just want to say thank you to all of our guests that we've had on in the past who are really willing to open up and really open those old wounds in an effort to help people, understand that there are outlets out there to help you in your trauma. and it's important to talk about our mental wellness. The next couple of episodes are going to be back to the old fun, us interviewing guests, but we are always looking for more guests for Family Twist. So if you know someone who has an interesting adoption story, a donor conception story, a DNA surprise, please, please, please continue reaching out to us. We answer every email, every direct message on Instagram, every comment on Instagram. So yeah, we want to hear from you.